Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 4 cheat sheet. We'll be looking at some of the key transfers this week, particularly within the midfield position where Odegaard is now injured. He might have some impacts on some of the other Arsenal assets within your team. It seems like he's a pretty big doubt for the North London derby with his potential injury within the Norway game versus Austria. On top of that, I would say this is a game week where a lot of people have 2 free transfers saved up finally, and this is a great week to make 2 transfers that can be very enabling for teams, particularly moving from, let's say, a Saka to a Salah. And on top of that, it's also a week where you can look at finally moving into, Brighton assets, Aston Villa assets, teams that actually have a really good fixture swing starting from now. We also have a little bit more information of teams and players and their minutes. So once again, transfers are rolling in, and it makes sense to do so once we get the full information from the international break. Some people are yet to play the second leg of their fixtures within the internationals. So João Pedro, for example, someone who has been called up to Brazil, will still probably feature on the bench, of course, in his game versus Brazil. We'll see, of course, how he manages to come back, and press conferences will be very key for this week. Before we jump into the cheat sheet content, though, I'd like to say that a lot of the series is supported by the data from Fantasy Football Hub. We have Opta stats on Fantasy Football Hub, which is amazing. Honestly, I find advanced data to be a very key part of my FPL play. On top of that, they have a lot of tools like expected points projections, AI suggestions as well, that are fantastic for increasing your rank as an FPL manager. They still have 50% off up until the end of this month. So do have a look at joining Fantasy Football Hub if you want to increase your rank as a football manager and also do well in your mini league or get your money back as well, which is another offer that they have. Stepping into this series with the cheat sheet, I'd also like to say this is a great time for people to hopefully subscribe to the channel. I hope that the content so far and the data that's been presented, it has been of use to you guys as an FPL manager. And if you guys enjoyed the cheat sheet, if you haven't been subscribed, probably more than 50% of you guys who are watching right now are not subscribed. If you can subscribe, that really does help improve the growth of the channel and supports me as well in my journey as an FPL manager and content creator. So let's jump into the cheat sheet. Adama gets a introduction to the cheat sheet. I was quite cautious in actually introducing Adama early on because one of the things when you see, let's say, a new season is questioning, of course, when someone like Adama who's only played a couple hundred minutes in the previous season, thinking about how many minutes he's going to play in the next season and looking at the early signs being very good in terms of minutes, but then also being cautious as to whether that can quickly change. It seems like, of course, with the outgoings for the season that Adama actually now is quite key towards what Marco Silva's plans are, and I'm very comfortably going to put him here because the underlying stats have been good so far. The minutes have been good as well, and I'm pretty comfortable just putting him as a yellow pick. It doesn't mean that necessarily he's an amazing transfer in, because I would say for the general attitude towards Fulham picks, I would say that the good run of games is reaching an end. And it's not like I'm that confident in Fulham as a team, either on defense or offense, to say that they're really good transfers, irrespective of their price point. Whereas for a team like Liverpool, for example, with their continued sort of improvement within defense and even slight improvement in offense under Slot so far, they might be a team where you'd be a little bit more comfortable holding them for the medium to long term. So that's why Adama finds himself in that sort of yellow tier. We still haven't had a real true update in terms of the priority of minutes between all the Man United wingers. So unfortunately, Garnacho's not in the cheat sheet. You see Ahmad and Rashford here, but I still have very little faith in terms of them as picks until we really see someone establish a position within the team. I feel like, if I'm being completely unbiased, maybe Ahmad and Garnacho's the best way forward. But I still don't believe Ten Hag will do that until maybe Rashford has another very poor game and we start to see a little bit of the evolution of the future minutes of these wingers. For now, I think it's just too risky going for Ahmad or even Garnacho or Rashford. In the 5.5 position, we've had some changes, mostly around Smith Rowe, who's dropped. And part of that comes down to the minutes haven't really improved too much so far for someone like Smith Rowe. He's playing in that sort of 70 bound per game. We mentioned Andreas as someone who previously was playing around 75 minutes per game. He's also playing a little bit deeper now, but the key thing with Smith Rowe that I would mention is, his minutes haven't been perfect. You're reaching an end to the Fulham games. The underlying stats haven't been very good, even on a per 90 basis for the start of the season. So he's not probably that rated compared to some of the other picks that we have, like Minte and Semenyo, who have been absolutely stellar on underlying stats. And even better, arguably, in terms of minutes. Semenyo definitely is the most nailed player in the 5.5 position across the board in FPL, simply because in the midfielders, there's no depth that Bournemouth have in that right-wing position to really displace Semenyo. He's also very clearly, in my opinion, the best player in the team, the best attacker on the team, and I think that his manager, Iraola, is very clearly behind that. Also sort of shouted him out after the Everton game, and basically intonated that he spearheaded that charge, which was that ridiculous comeback versus Everton. As far as Minte, he actually is getting a pretty long break for the international break. He finished his last game and has around 6 days of rest until game week 4, so that's fantastic. We know that there's players like Rutter who can even play in the right wing position, and of course some other players who are going to join the team. Adingra as well can play in the right wing position. But I would say with Minte that I'm pretty confident that he is still the starting right winger. Would I say that he's nailed for 90 minutes a game? Absolutely not. It seems like he's going to be a 71, 78, maybe sometimes 80 plus minute substitute, depending on how he's performing within the game, which is still amazing, right? At this sort of price point, I think we also need to take João Pedro aside, because I'm not of the mind that you need to only have one Brighton player and that's enough. I think if you want to go and stack with multiple Brighton players and you see João Pedro as a little bit of an essential FPL pick, which I actually do, there's nothing wrong with actually double stacking on Brighton offense. They've got 2 really good fixtures, and in the distant future, if you can, let's say, bench someone like Minte, that's fine. That's actually very, very sound strategy to me, because someone at this sort of 5.x position shouldn't necessarily be a consistent starting player within your FPL team, unless they prove to be as good as Semenyo has been so far. And that's sort of my thoughts in the sort of 5.x position. At the 6.5 position, we have no real changes. We have a Mitoma rise. First and foremost, he's already gotten a couple price rises so far. Seems like he's pretty close to 6.7 million within the game. Do I think he's actually worth the additional money compared to Minte? Not necessarily, because I see Minte as someone who could potentially be an 8th attacker within your team, someone that can rotate a bit. Whereas at that sort of price point of Mitoma at Sobo, I do think you're actually asking for this person or this player to actually consistently start for multiple games. And am I that infused by Mitoma? Not necessarily in terms of open play stats, right? The open play stats so far from Mitoma have been really good. Across the board, I'd say Brighton actually look like an improved team. On offense, on defense, that seems to be the case. And part of that might just be that there was a bit of a drop-off last season after Brighton was struggling with the lack of depth that they had when they were competing in the European fixtures, and then also with the announcement of De Zerbi leaving, before the season ended. So I do think, of course, improvement from Brighton so far, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Mitoma is that amazing of a pick. I'd still be pretty comfortable going for Minte if you have room, if you have space to go for Mitoma. If you're looking at him and players like Sobo as a bit more of a 2 to 3 game week punt, right? Sobo has really good fixtures between game weeks 4 and 7. Someone like Mitoma generally has 2 amazing fixtures, and then of course there's still going to be fixtures after that where Brighton players are playable. But if you have a little bit more of a short-term view towards these players, I think they're still amazing transfers because they are definitely still worth their price. It's just whether or not you'd prefer having an 8th attacker in that sort of 5.x position, and sometimes I think there's a bit of a balance there. It just depends on your team structure. With Bailey, he gets a small drop. I think he'll be fine going forwards. It's just that the minutes are still a bit of a concern to me. That small injury in the previous game is also another slight issue. We'll see how he sort of develops as we go on with the international break and we get sort of news from Unai Emery from the press conferences. But he gets a minor drop related to sort of the injury. With Gibbs White, he gets a drop because, of course, going back to last week, we had an amazing fixture in Game Week 3, which was Wolves at home. But now you are looking at the end of that perfect swing for Nottingham Forest. Yes, of course, Game Week 6 is a good fixture for Nottingham Forest, but you're still looking at 2 really tough fixtures, and of course, he gets another drop. We also know that he's pretty much lost all his set pieces now, and I still think it's quite iffy to say whether or not he's got penalties. And so an attacker in open play for Nottingham Forest isn't something that I'm that infused by. In the 7.x position, no changes here. In the 7.5 plus position, though, we've got Luis Diaz getting a rise, but I do think it comes with a small asterisk, which is, of course, that South American travel. He's going to play a lot of minutes in these 2 fixtures. He's already played a lot in his first game, even scored in his first game, which is a big positive as well. But he's going to play Argentina, and then he's actually going to travel back to Liverpool. And then the question is going to be whether or not he's going to be, struggling with a little bit of training, jet lag, all these sorts of things, and honestly, just a bit of match fitness, because he's played a lot of matches so far. I think that Gakpo, for the interim, has actually played quite well as a substitute and maybe can actually get the start over Luis Diaz just simply due to fitness, because we also have Champions League around the corner. As far as Jota, I would say that Darwin's looked pretty poor as a substitute so far, and it doesn't really seem like he's going to really take the minutes as a starter away from Jota. I'd be a little bit more comfortable in Jota's minutes for the meantime, but that isn't to say that Luis Diaz is a bad pick, which is also why he gets a rise. His underlying data so far has been really good. I would still say, have a look at the open play data in the past, obviously under a different manager, and then just consider that Luis Diaz isn't as great of a pick as he looks in terms of the underlying stats so far. There are players like Semenyo, players like Luis Diaz who have looked incredible to start the season, but whether I think they actually can hold this level of underlying sort of goal involvement is something that I think is yet to be seen until we are 5-10 game weeks down in the season. I would expect some of these numbers to tail off a little bit for the likes of Luis Diaz, but it doesn't mean that he's a bad pick. He's still really, really good. With Bowen Madison, no changes there. I gave Bowen a rise last week, and I'm pretty comfortable sort of seeing him as a strong pick. Crystal Palace away is not, or Fulham away rather, is actually still a pretty tough fixture in the sense that it's an away game. We know that Fulham always perform very well at home, but generally this is the start of the good run of games for Bowen. So if you're sort of interested in a bit of a differential in this position, if you're maybe triple stacked with Liverpool, you're looking for a downgrade, that's a one free transfer away from someone like Bruno. If you really want to make that move, you can go there. Personally, I'm still really high on someone like Bruno. You might disagree, and that's fine. I'm just someone who just generally believes that people who post really good underlying data will eventually just get returns like he did many times last season. But of course, on the total points side of things, he's been pretty dull for the last 2 seasons. That's speaking to Bruno and not Bowen. But generally speaking, with Bruno, he's got a good fixture himself this week with Southampton away. Do I see him as a drop? No, but maybe, of course, we see once again another poor performance from United again, and Bruno a little bit more quiet like he was in the Liverpool game compared to, let's say, game weeks 1 and 2, where he actually had lots of chances, had opportunities to score, had opportunities to assist. Then we can reassess once again. With Odegaard, unfortunately, it seems like he got a really bad injury, as I said at the start of this video. It seems like he's going to be a drop. I don't see him being fit for the North London derby, but maybe Arteta is going to correct me. I've seen some very, very interim analysis online from sort of physios on the internet. That's probably not a very good source of medical information as to player availability, but it seems like it's not the worst injury in the world. But Odegaard did seem like, and he was in a lot of pain, and I imagine that with the Rice suspension, that's a huge impact on Arsenal's midfield setup in the North London derby. So not looking great. Probably also means that it has a knock-on impact on someone like Kai Havertz, which I'll talk about in the forward position. As far as Foden, he also got some rest during the international break. Him and Palmer in specific, I'll talk about Palmer in a moment, but Foden getting a bit of rest maybe means that he'll get some more minutes going forwards. But I think the issue with Foden is that he does deserve a drop simply because you're looking at a player who has not really gotten much fitness at all. He's missed a lot of training, didn't have a real preseason, and ultimately players like KDB, Bernardo Silva, even Rico Lewis, you can argue operating in midfield positions now, they've been much more fit, and it makes more sense for them to actually continue playing in the meantime, as opposed to Foden immediately sort of stepping in there and getting starts, getting 90 minutes in his boot. So I really feel like Foden will be a little bit of a late acclimation towards this team. Some other players like Walker, for example, who have already been in training for 2, 3, 4 weeks now, we might see them integrated a little bit sooner than Foden. With KDB, I think with Arsenal around the corner, it's not exactly the best swing of games. I probably think the best time to move into KDB was probably something like last week. I would say I've probably misinterpreted some of the minutes of KDB, and part of that is because of also thinking about Gundo availability, about Foden availability, which obviously that didn't pan out to be real, right? Foden was unavailable for the last 2 games. The illness seems to be quite severe, or at least in terms of timelines wasn't perfect for his availability for game weeks 3 and also 2. So we'll see what happens with Foden, but I think KDB is still an interesting pick. Would I see him as a transfer in this week? I think if you've got money in the bank, if you're interested in the move, there's definitely some potential there. But then the issue is going to be Arsenal's the next game. It's not exactly a great fixture. So do you feel that confident in moving into KDB when his minutes could definitely tail off with Champions League around the corner, with Foden coming back to full fitness after game week 5, so on and so forth. So that's my sort of issue with KDB and why I'm reluctant to give him a rise. I felt like if you went for KDB in the meantime and you have him for the Brentford game, amazing. As far as the 10.x assets, Palmer stays at the sort of top position. Saka gets a drop. And part of that is simply because, as I said last week, there's going to be a bit of a yo-yo effect with teams like Arsenal, Liverpool, etc. with the fixture swings. With Arsenal, you have 2 fixtures that are pretty poor now. I think Arsenal look like a much weakened team with Odegaard out with the Rice suspension for the North London derby. That's going to have some small knock-on impacts on someone like Saka, right? I think I'm not going to have the same level of confidence in Arsenal offense if Rice and Odegaard are suspended compared to when they're available for the pitch and available for selection. So Saka gets a drop. Son is where he is, and Salah remains at that sort of prime position because ultimately he's just an amazing captaincy pick for the next few weeks, and Liverpool have just looked brilliant to start the season off with. Once again, I have to shout out my What We've Learned series. We've been talking about some of the underlying stats so far, how the performances within the first 3 game weeks of the season have changed some of our team strength models and metrics. So with 11FI's model, you can see that his attack team rating within the What We've Learned video for Liverpool hasn't moved too much, but actually it's the defense where Liverpool have improved the most. And I think it's such a relevant section to jump into when we talk about Liverpool defense later on in the video. In terms of the forwards, moving on to that, many changes here are just around short-term fixture swings and then also the changes in minutes of key players. So you can see Strand Larsen gets a rise, Calvert-Lewin gets a rise, Armstrong gets a drop. Even Welbeck gets a rise, and Welbeck, I would say, is definitely fixture related. I see him more as a short to medium term transfer. With Evan Ferguson not really being close to match fit, I would say that Welbeck's an amazing 2-week move, particularly if you're someone who's, let's say, minded to go for a Game Week 6 wildcard. If that's what you're planning for, if you're looking for a midfielder this week, Welbeck's actually an amazing transfer. And I think when you look at the underlying stats so far, it's very clear that center forwards will always get better chances. He's gotten better chances than João Pedro. But the big difference is that he's also going to be someone prone to being an early substitution, probably given his age. And João Pedro is someone more likely to play more minutes. But with João Pedro actually being called up to Brazil, with the South American sort of traveling impacts prevailing around João Pedro, maybe there's going to be some soft impacts on him too and his minutes. But I think João Pedro is definitely the best long-term pick. I would actually say that João Pedro probably rivals, I would much rather have João Pedro over all the 6.x forwards in the game. And I say that with full confidence right now. I think that's just how good he is as an asset. I might have overstated his minutes, and maybe we'll see that he loses his minutes over the course of the season to other players within the team. But with no sort of UCL impacts for a team like Brighton, no European impacts more so, I'm really confident João Pedro's a pick, and Welbeck just for the short term. As far as Strand Larsen, Calvert-Lewin, Armstrong, this is more a reflection of minutes. Calvert-Lewin as well, a little bit with performance. The issue with Calvert-Lewin for the last 2 seasons has always been the stop-start nature, I would say, of his minutes. We see games where he plays 70, sometimes he's coming off the bench. What we saw, though, at the start of the season is around 2 70-minute games, and then actually an 87-minute game versus Bournemouth where he played really well. My question, though, is that repeatable? Is that going to happen going forwards? Are we saying that he's finally fit after 2 years of pretty tumultuous sort of ins and outs in terms of being match fit, in terms of being injured? I'm still a little bit cautious on that, which is why Calvert-Lewin is not green right now. But I think he's got the potential to be actually the best pick of the bunch of these 5.x players. Maybe Nketiah will actually rise sooner than later and actually be a more interesting option. But I would say Calvert-Lewin is very tempting if you think that his minutes are going to be more around that upper bound. So if he's going to be playing closer to 80 minutes a game, if, let's say, Sean Dyche will actually believe that he's fit enough to play like that, and we don't see these early Beto substitutions, then the better Calvert-Lewin is as a pick. And you can make that decision after Game Week 4. Game Week 4 is a really tough game for Everton compared to the rest of their fixture run after that. So you can make that decision, and we will see where Calvert-Lewin falls. As far as Strand Larsen, couple tough fixtures for Wolves, but once again, if you're considering a wild card, you might want to double up in terms of 2 cheap budget forwards. He's an interesting pick now who seems like he's actually getting very consistent minutes per game and very clearly playing center forward for Wolves. With Armstrong, though, we're seeing the exact opposite. I mentioned at the start of the season, the preseason, where with some of the transfers coming in for Southampton, I was a little bit concerned about whether Armstrong could hold his spot within the team. I must say I never expected him to be a 45-minute substitution, particularly this early into the season, but we've already seen that. And that's a huge sort of red signal for what we can expect for Armstrong's minutes. And so we've seen a huge move away from, let's say, João Pedro, his priority in the game, versus Armstrong. It's a bit of an unfortunate swing, I have to mention, for managers who've actually gone into Armstrong. But unfortunately, he's going to drop because minutes are king in FPL. To me, at least. As far as the forward position in the 6.x's, I've added Wissa. A lot of people actually asked me in the comment section last week about Wissa, and I think that was totally fair. I responded to everyone in the comment section actually that if you got the news that Tonio was actually going to leave Brentford before the transfer window ended, that Wissa would actually be considered as a green or a yellow pick, and a green pick specifically with the context of Game Week 3 being the key fixture there for Brentford. And he actually left, right? Tony left before the transfer window was over. And Wissa scored in that match. No surprise, really, versus Southampton. His underlying stats are really good. His minutes have been amazing when Tony's not part of the team. I think Wissa's a great pick going forwards. And of course, now that we actually know that I'm recording a video with Tony actually out of the league and out of the game, that Wissa, of course, deserves to be a good pick. Technically, I would be sort of pulling back his rating from green to yellow simply because the next 2 fixtures are not great for Brentford. So it's more of a signaling purpose to say, wait for game week 6 to go for someone like Yoane Wissa, and that's pretty much it. Muniz, Cunha, still pretty cold on both in terms of them being green essential sort of type picks, simply because Muniz right now, he's of course reaching the tail end of his games. His underlying stats so far have been really, really good. So I would say that if you're holding Muniz, West Ham at home, Newcastle at home, these are really good games. I would not be that concerned with Muniz as a transfer out. However, what I will say with Muniz though is that I don't see him necessarily as an essential pick going forward. So once you reach the end of these Fulham games, he's definitely a targeted transfer out. As far as Cunha though, it's more about waiting for the end of this sort of poor run of games for Wolves, and then actually when you can catch the green run of games starting very, very soon, then Cunha becomes actually a very elite pick, because even for the start of the season, he's had really good underlying numbers, and I still think he has a decent amount of pen share, even though it might be split amongst players like Sarabia and Hwang. As far as Wood, he also gets a drop, and that's simply fixture related, very close to Morgan Gibbs-White. I have no sort of ill will to Wood. I think he's one of my favorite players in terms of FPL sort of niche lore. If you guys remember last season, the free hit on Game Week 29, I went for Wood, which was a pretty unpopular pick at the time. But yeah, I love Wood. Always have loved his underlying stats. I think he's on penalties. But the issue is I do think that Taiwo will continue to take minutes away from him. And we're also probably going to see, once again, less performances from a team like Nottingham Forest when the 2 next fixtures are really poor. And this is a good time to sort of move someone like Wood into a João Pedro and sort of capitalize on that fixture swing. As far as the 7.x position, a lot of people are very high on Jackson, and I think that's fair in the sense that Jackson has always been amazing in terms of underlying stats. You know, if he's actually able to sort of match his underlying stats with, you know, very, very similar goal performance and not underscore like he did last season, then he's a great pick. But one of the early signs that we've seen this season is that his minutes haven't necessarily been at the level of when he was under Pochettino. However, he did play 90 minutes in Game Week 3, so if you maybe subscribe to the idea that Jackson probably had a pretty tame preseason, didn't get enough minutes in the preseason, needed to be built up, might not be used within the Conference League too much, so therefore gets a lot of rest for the Premier League, and you think that his minutes are more towards that 70, 80 plus range, then I think Jackson's actually maybe even a better pick than I've sort of suggested here. What I am looking at though is that there must be some game states where you're seeing someone like Jackson who doesn't really have a like-for-like replacement in the team, but there are other players who can sort of play in that 9 position, like João Felix, like Nkunku at times, that can sub him off and mean that Jackson won't be necessarily playing 90 minutes a game. And that's my only concern with Jackson, where I'd say the fixture run is very good. Very similar to Palmer, he's probably one of the few Chelsea players and attackers that I would actually want to invest into. But for now, I would say that I'm a little bit cold on Jackson, just simply because I don't think that without penalties, without perfect minutes, that he is an absolute lock within that price point. I'd still much rather have the Mbumos, the Ezes of the world in that midfield position than actually spend that sort of money for the forward. As far as Solanke, we just want to basically see that he's actually close to full fitness, that he's taken the international break and some of the time recently to recover. I still think that there might be maybe a rebuilding of that sort of fitness. Who knows how that injury is and how he's dealing with it. Maybe it's the case that we see good minutes versus Arsenal and he plays 90 minutes and we're already enthused by the prospect of going for Solanke as a Game Week 5 transfer. But for now, with the lack of information that I have on his sort of recovery process, I think that Solanke is definitely an orange for this week, but can easily move into either a yellow or a green, depending on the minutes outcomes versus Arsenal. As far as someone like Mateta, though, I'm going to give him a drop because even though Leicester at home is such an amazing fixture, and I think you should definitely keep Mateta for Leicester at home, my concern overall is whether his minutes this season will just generally be a little bit poor. And I think that maybe, of course, he's a touch overpriced in the sense that I like Eze because he's got all the tools going for him, right? With exception to maybe a little bit of XG, which obviously the center forward will always have a good share of XG within any team. Mateta doesn't have that much going for him compared to some of the other forwards in the game, right? It's not like he's on penalties, which I think Eze actually is on. And also, once again, with these sort of early substitutions, with even Edouard gone, but Nketiah actually joining the team, then ultimately, I'm not sure if I'm that high on Mateta as a pick. With Crystal Palace also being a touch worse on attack because of the loss of Elise and some of the key players. As far as Havertz, I also sense a drop from him. Part of this is because in the North London derby now, you're probably looking at Kai Havertz left center mid. You have Rice suspended, you have Odegaard potentially injured, and it could be severe. I'm sure Arsenal will sort of analyze the situation and the injury, but I don't think that Odegaard will be risked. So more than likely, we're going to see Havertz left center mid, which is probably much more dull, as I've mentioned time and time again. Looking at the comparison of players like Son left wing versus Son center forward, Havertz left center mid versus Havertz center forward, there's a huge gulf in terms of the XG share for these players when they're not playing in the center forward position. I much rather Havertz playing center forward. So if you can guarantee me Havertz playing center forward for the short term, I would definitely go for Havertz and actually find a way to, let's say, get him into my FPL team. But for now, with the left center mid game, with City around the corner as well in Game Week 5, not too enthused by the idea of Havertz. As far as Isak, Watkins, Haaland, I think it's really positive for Watkins that he actually got that break and that rest in the international break. I think with Isak too, you have to say that his fixture run really ends after Game Week 5. I would still look at Isak as a bit of a hold. Now, a lot of people have made 2 free transfers to go out of Isak into someone like João Pedro or Welbeck and then actually move Saka to Salah. And I think that's totally fine. That's a very good, powerful 2 free transfer usage in FPL if it wasn't for a hit, simply because you're going to also maximize on the Salah captaincy aspect in Game Week 5 and potentially even in Game Week 4 if you choose Salah captaincy there. But the key point I would mention is that Isak is still someone who's very, very good. Yes, Newcastle looks somewhat poor in the team offense side of things, but it doesn't really mean that Isak's going to have no roots towards scoring. So I think similar to the Eze situation of how people have been sort of writing off a team like Crystal Palace for the first 2 game weeks of the season, but then Eze actually scores from a very, very low range effort or low, sort of low quality effort. Isak is also a similar type of player with the same type of quality that can sort of create some unimaginable things, right? I think he even hit the post within the Tottenham game early on from a ridiculous chance. And that's just the quality of Isak as a player. I think there's no reason to really drop him up until after really Fulham away. As far as Watkins, really nice that he actually got the rest in the international break, as I mentioned earlier. I think his minutes will continue to tick up. It seems like it's going to tick up a little bit slower than we actually expected, but 2 weeks is very significant for a footballer, and things can change very, very quickly in terms of the landscape of, you know, the minutes of a certain player. So I do feel like Watkins is someone who I would look at with a little bit of an upwards trend. Do I see him as a transfer in for this week for my team, for example? No, but if you've already transferred in Watkins into your team, I think that's perfect. Hold him. He has a great run of games. Let him see it out. At least see out the Wolves at home fixture, and then you can revisit Watkins and what you want to do with him if the minutes are still very, very poor after that. With Haaland, I mean, this guy just scored 2 hat-tricks, so I don't really think there's much to discuss. One thing I'll mention is that it doesn't necessarily mean that with Haaland and Salah performing so well that you need to have a fixed understanding of a certain player or to completely reevaluate how you feel about these players. We have base expectations of these players. They've definitely overshot compared to our expectations early on in Game Weeks 1 to 3, but there's nothing to say that they can have sort of somewhat poorer performances, underperformances at time. And I think that's going to happen over the course of a full season. So it doesn't mean that we need to suddenly rip up all our drafts to go for Haaland plus Salah. I think it's very viable right now. If I was Game Week 4 wildcarding, I probably would have both. But the point is to say, if you are persisting with your team structure, I don't think you need to rip your teams apart to suddenly get Haaland in the team if you're a Salah only drafter. If you're a Haaland only drafter, I don't think you need to do the same necessarily with Salah, but the fixture swing actually does somewhat accommodate for that a little bit more because simply Haaland has an Arsenal game. Liverpool's fixtures are still really good up until Game Week 7. As far as the defense, moving on to that, just some changes in the 4.0 position right now. Greaves being introduced, Mosquera still there, Faye still there, Howard Bellis dropping because Southampton's fixtures are getting slightly worse. I also think that the data from Southampton from a defensive point of view looks really poor too. Arguably, they're the worst team in the league so far. In the 4.x position, or the 4.5 position rather, I've added Pau, Guehi, and Van Heck. This is really just to show, once again, the reflection of how I feel about certain teams and their runs of games in the short term, right? Guehi has some pretty good fixtures, Van Heck as well. I would actually consider that Van Heck is also probably as nailed as someone like Lewis Dunk, so if you want a differential, there's that. With Pau Torres, same case with Konsa. Do I think Konsa and Dunk are better sort of set piece threats? Yes, and that's simply why I would go with players like Konsa and Dunk, but there's absolutely no reason to not go with Pau. If you prefer the sort of ball playing abilities of Pau, you think that maybe he can create the assist that, for example, Kilman did as a ball playing defender, then of course there's that value there. With Guehi, you're looking at a nailed Crystal Palace defender at a very good price as well. With Van Heck, once again, another very ball playing defender, but I would mention too that Dunk creates a lot of chances. He might even be on some set pieces, so Dunk is still very valuable, and I think I find it hard to believe that Dunk will get benched for Webster, but there could be a small, slim possibility that it happens. I still find it rather unlikely. As far as the Colwill, Robinson, Van de Ven, Mykolenko sort of types of players, Mykolenko got a drop last week. I think maybe that was a bit harsh for me, but I did just really feel that Everton really looked poor. And I think I wanted to reflect that last week. It's more than likely after the Aston Villa game that I might revisit Mikolenko and where he is. With Van de Ven, though, Robinson and Colwill, I think it's just about fixtures getting slightly worse for these players. Ultimately, let's say with Colwill, you've just come off of Crystal Palace at home, which is a really good fixture. I always really like home fixtures. With Robinson, you've already gone through 2 of these sort of promoted teams. And honestly, Fulham still look like a really poor defense. And so even though Robertson has looked like a good attacker, it's not like his underlying stats are suggesting that he's going to get an assist per game. An assist per game would actually be a huge overperformance for him, which has been the case for the last 2 weeks. So when you look at his underlying stats, compare them to the likes of Porro, to the likes of Trent, that's very, very different. With, let's say, Colwill, though, I'd also mention that going back to it, Chelsea's defense have looked pretty poor to start things off. Do I think that Maresca is suddenly much worse and making Chelsea much worse? I don't think so. I just think that maybe if, let's say, the team has moved on from Poch, it's probably that they actually look slightly better on the offense, potentially, but definitely a touch worse on defense. And that's sort of my takeaway there. Emerson, I've added him as, I think, as a fullback, as someone who also is embarking a decent run of games now with West Ham. He's an interesting pick. With Dean, I'm still a little bit concerned about overall the minutes. If you told me that Dean was going to play 85 to 90 minutes per game, I think he's going to be a green pick, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. But it does creep into my mind that particularly when, let's say, someone like Gerard Moreno was competing with that sort of position with Dean, that very often we'd see what would happen is actually 59-minute substitution sometimes, particularly if Aston Villa weren't playing well, or once again, benchings. And I do feel like Dean is very prone to that because of how good Maatsen is as a player. It seems like Dean has very clearly deserved and sort of obtained this starting spot, but how long will that last is one of my concerns with Dean, and that's why I still hold him as a differential. If you feel like you have a good read on Dean's minutes for the short term and you think they're going to be really good, then clearly he's a green pick. But I'm not really to sort of take that leap of faith right now in judgment. As far as Davis, he gets introduced to the cheat sheet. I think he's a very, very solid asset. Once again, Davis is a very weird pick where it's not often that you'll actually find a player who is playing for a promoted team will ever feature within the cheat sheet, unless he's a 4.0 player. Davis, however, when I was looking into the preseason sort of numbers and just sort of reassessing how I thought about some of these promoted teams and their key players, I have to say that Davis looked like a much better version of Doughty, right? Someone who was actually an even larger threat in open play, had absolutely ridiculous numbers compared to any fullback really in the world, and he really did strike out to me. So Davis is someone who I think with a good run of games now, which Ipswich has, and he's already got an assist in the previous match, although of course it was sort of an assist to a worldie. Davis is definitely someone to look at. Do I think he's immediately going to be a green pick? No, because the reality is you are going to suffer as a bit of an attacking fullback this season with the -4 BPS per sort of goal conceded, with the reality that Ipswich sort of conceding much more goals is very probable and, you know, is more likely the case than any of the other teams that are sitting within the mid-table, and I would say are sort of mid-table and above defenses. So an Aston Villa, a Crystal Palace, a Brighton, I still think that the quality defense are much higher. So the propensity of, let's say, conceding 1 point per game for 2 goals conceded, it feels much more less likely than someone like Davis, even though there's a bit of a gap in terms of maybe the offensive quality. And I think that's just a point on Davis as to why he's not green. At the 5.0 position, no real changes. I've actually added Dalot with a rise because I do think that ultimately, you know, after the Liverpool game, United have an okay run of fixtures, and generally speaking, that Dalot is an interesting pick. Is he anywhere close to being a green? No, but with Shaw maybe coming back soon, you kind of have Mazraoui also dropping out of the cheat sheet. Who knows what's going to happen there? I still think that Dalot has absolutely sort of locked his position with the team. I'd be shocked if he wasn't actually playing consistently alongside Shaw. And so I do think Mazraoui gets, you know, knocked off the cheat sheet, but Dalot is actually an interesting pick because we've always known that he's someone who's a little bit more interesting than some of the other fullbacks for teams. And ultimately, I would say he's more offensive than some players like maybe Cucurella, for example, who is very clear, is very essential to, let's say, the build-up play of a certain FPL team, or a certain team rather, like Chelsea, but actually maybe isn't as offensive as someone like Dalot. But Estupiñán, Konate, I think these players are very risky still. Kadioglu being as good as he is, I think that you can probably see his position maybe chop and change over the course of the season. I'm not sure if Estupiñán is a 100% nailed asset. If I knew he was, he'd be a green. Same with Konate as well, where I do think if something like Quansah can happen in the 45th minute of game week 1, I wonder if that can potentially happen to Konate in the future. Once again, if you have a little bit more of a sort of, you know, risk hungry point of view on that, Liverpool defense look incredible. And if you can get access to a permanently starting Liverpool defender at 5.0, just like the appeal of Quansah was in game week 1, that's amazing value, right? With the 5.0 player here. But is it too good to be true? I feel like as someone who maybe was, dealt with the Kwanzaa hand in game week 1, I feel like that's the case. But maybe if you really feel like that's not the case, and Konate actually has looked incredible, which he has, he's looked really strong so far, and Liverpool have looked really robust with him in the team, then he's obviously a great pick. With Kukurea, I think a little bit of a drop here, obviously moving off the Crystal Palace game, and generally speaking, Chelsea being a touch worse on defense compared to my own expectations. As far as some of the other sort of movements here, Akanji gets a small drop, and part of that, of course, is with the Arsenal fixture around the corner, but then also a lot of the other key players who I expect to get minutes over the course of the season, getting a few more minutes already so far, and I do think that in terms of, let's say, priority, I would say that Guardiola's position the team's a little bit more nailed than Akanji's. I might be wrong on that. I think Akanji has always been, as I said, someone who I find to be very key for the way Pep wants to play. He's also very fast, which is a very key asset as well right now in modern football. So ultimately, I don't think this rise or this drop rather is something that's going to hugely impact people who own Akanji. Ultimately, access to a City defender at 5.5 is still really good value, and hopefully he continues to get the starts that we expect from him. I still think, though, with Liverpool looking as good as they have, players like Robertson, players like Trent, even Van Dijk at where they are, they deserve to be where they are. Even if, let's say, Liverpool to sort of reach their run of games at the end of game week 6, I think they've comfortably moved, already looked as good of a defense as they really could have been under Slot. And I'm expecting, bigger and better things from this Liverpool defense going forward. So my general thought, I would say, to approaching Liverpool defense is, I'm not sure if every team needs to stretch towards Trent. If you can have 1 million in the bank and you can spread that to, create better depth within your team, maybe have rotation in your team, I would probably still go for Robertson, even though there's a huge gulf so far in terms of expected goal involvement. I just think Trent has been molten hot in underlying stats, but also you need to quantify that he's not playing 90 minutes per game. That Bradley substitution has been seen twice. It can happen at 70, 75 minutes now. So when you're looking at underlying stats and you're looking at Trent per 90, try to be a bit more careful about understanding what the impact of that is. Because I still think Robertson so far, available substitutes a little bit worse than Tsimikas, so his minutes might be just generally better. We also know he's pain-free, which is very, very crucial. But Champions League might also change that too, because Robertson's obviously the older player of the two, and maybe both their minutes will be somewhat managed in the sense that they're early substitutions for games where they've dominated and they have a really sort of safe and comfortable lead. All things being said, Robertson's also taking a lot of set pieces, so I think he also has a lot of value within the game. Yes, of course, Trent looks like the most lethal offensive player in the game, similar to Porro as well, where I think, once again, average position, amount of shots taken as well. These players are super scary, but you don't need to have them all, which is always the case in FPL. In the goalkeepers, the only change here is that Muric is new. I think Ipswich's run of games are quite good, so that's why he's been added. I also think, look, all of us are trying to sometimes find value and squeeze 0.1 within our teams. Maybe the 0.1 is something that you're willing to sort of go for, because I don't think keepers are that substantially different in FPL. There's a lot of routes towards keeper points. Sometimes you can get a lot of points, like last season. Kaminsky actually got a ton of points just simply making a lot of saves. Someone like Verbruggen might be getting a lot of his points from saves, but more so maybe clean sheets. Flecken probably gets a lot of his points from saves, which we know is the case with Brentford, where they've conceded a lot of sort of low quality XG shots, but conceded shots. And so I think with keepers, we probably overestimate how impactful the quality defense is, particularly for these 4.Xs. And so actually getting someone at 4.4 is pretty good value sometimes, because that could give you a little bit more value. I've already taken, I think, 0.2 worth of, or 0.3 worth of price falls this season. And sometimes I'm going to have to find players at the 4.9 price range or the 4.4 price range. And maybe Muric is your guy. I'm really enthused by Verbruggen being the number one, so that's why he gets a huge rise here. Flecken as well and him, I think, are my favorite keepers. I might even say that the rotation of Verbruggen and Flecken is actually my favorite 5.0 keeper as well. Martinez following closely behind. All the other keepers, I don't have too much thoughts on. I think Pickford, of course, we gave him a drop last week. Still pretty comfortable, not really rating Everton defense until Brathwaite comes back. With Areola and Pope, they do get falls, because I think early signs for both Newcastle and West Ham on defense haven't been amazing. Clearly, West Ham have tougher fixtures, but of course, even when looking at fixture adjusted sort of metrics and also the Areola injury, these players get a fall. Liverpool, Arsenal, Man City, all looking good as defenses. No real thoughts on them. I think it might make sense actually to go for a 5.5 goalkeeper this season if you can leave room for a team that allows for it. And that's my thoughts in terms of the Game Week 4 cheat sheet. A little bit of a long one. I hope you guys appreciate the time taken into this video. If you haven't subscribed, as I mentioned at the start of the video, please do subscribe. It really does help support the channel. Hope you guys enjoyed the content, and I'll see you guys for the next video. guys.